My favourite experience in all of audio is hearing a pair of speakers that can properly replicate the feel, the scale and the experience of listening to live music. Actually, my favourite experience in all of audio is listening to live music. But when that's not possible, that's when a great 2-channel setup is the next best thing. And I'll never forget an experience I had when I used to work for Bang & Olufsen here in Australia. We were launching the Beolab 5 speakers. They were a full-range, active loudspeaker that retailed for around about $16,000 when released, and they sounded magnificent. So magnificent, in fact, that I remember walking towards the function room that we'd booked for the launch of the Beolab 5s and wondering who'd booked live music. I hadn't been aware of a plan for live music, but there it was. There was a jazz band playing in the function room. When I opened the door to the function room, the band vanished. I don't know how they did it, but all they left behind was a pair of Beolab 5 speakers. Those speakers had the depth and power in the bass, combined with the tonal accuracy and the imaging capabilities to properly recreate the experience of listening to live music. They had power, clarity and finesse all in equal measure. Hearing the Dali core speakers at the Northern AV show in Penang last year was another similar experience. It's an experience that I absolutely adore and that I chase. It's an experience that's always eluded me in the world of headphones. That is, until now. I've talked before about the fact that there is no such thing as a perfect headphone. Even at the flagship level of $4,000+ headphones, there's always trade-offs. And this isn't the video where I tell you that that's suddenly changed. It is still true. You can have incredible clarity and insight, so long as you're happy to sacrifice a bit of bass realism. And when I say a word like realism or naturality in this video, my point of reference is how music sounds when you're listening to live music. And I mean live music that hasn't been pushed and over-amplified through some big PA system. In the headphone world, you can get better bass presence if you want to, but it's going to come at the cost of some slightly unnatural treble tonality on certain tracks. You can also get fantastic bass punch if you want to, so long as you're happy to lose a little bit of the deep bass extension and deal with some slightly questionable mid-range tonality at times as well. Basically, every flagship headphone has its great features and characteristics, but none could replicate the experience of listening to live music or a great 2-channel system. Note my use of the past tense there though. None of those could replicate that sound. These can though. These are the Bandoss Avija Precision headphones. I'll just be calling them the Avijas for the rest of this video. They're a €5,000 headphone made in Italy, and they're absolutely remarkable. That price translates to about $5,900 or about 8,900 Australian dollars. So you'd be right to expect a lot from these headphones. And they do deliver. And while you're already staggering at the price, I should add that they also sound best when paired with the optional upgrade cable from Marco Custom Cables. That adds an extra €700 to the price tag, and that'll bring you to 10,130 Australian dollars or about $6,700. And I'll tell you more about the value of that upgrade in just a moment. First though, let me tell you about the design of the Avijas. They use an anodized aluminium frame that's available in either the all-black variant that I've got here or in a striking black and gold variant. And Avija apparently is a word from northern Italy that refers to bees. It seems to be a local dialectic term rather than the Italian word for bee, but either way, you can clearly see the reference to bees in the design of the Avijas, specifically this hexagonal grille pattern, that and the black and gold colorway. And speaking of the design of these headphones, I did read somewhere that somebody felt like they weren't at the level of a premium flagship headphone, but I'm not sure how they came to that conclusion. Perhaps they were listening to more of a prototype than a finished production model. I do know that Frank, the designer of the Avijas, is always working to improve the fit and finish of the headphones, so it's quite possible that the pair I have here is better than the pair that person was trying. All I can say is that this pair, the one that I have physically touched, listened to and looked at, looks and feels like a proper flagship headphone. But on that note, they're also very heavy, thanks to some big, gold diaphragm planar magnetic drivers with double-sided magnet arrays, the Avijas weigh in at a fairly hefty 570 grams. Comfort is good though, thanks to some fairly thick plush pads and also a suspension-style headband. The headband is high-quality leather with a couple of extra padded bumps built in, although for my head, the bumps are just a little bit too far apart and it allows the top of my head to press against the headband. Thankfully, the headband does include some little screws to adjust the elastic mechanism of the suspension, and so with a bit of playing around, I was able to get these to be pretty comfortable for long listening sessions. And I say pretty comfortable because when you're playing at this level, there are headphones like the Meze Elites in the world, and those are just sublimely comfortable. And so for me, the Avijas sit on the tier below the Elites, with other great options like the Susvaras, the Focal Utopias, and basically most other flagship models. However, I have provided some feedback to Frank about my experience with the placement and the size of the bumps, so future versions may have wider bumps or have the bumps closer together. As I said, Frank seems to constantly be tweaking the fit and finish of the headphones, not the internal design of the drivers or anything, and so future models may get even more comfortable still. And then on top of that, comfort with headphones seems to be about as subjective, maybe more subjective, than the sound quality of the headphones. So you might just love these straight out of the box. But that's enough about headbands. Let's talk really quickly about the pads so we can move on to the sound. As I've already said, these are a very thick plush pad design. But because the material is a perforated microfiber, they stay comfortable and cool for long listening sessions, even in warmer weather. By being quite deep and quite soft, the pads also produce an excellent seal and a consistent seal against the head, and they keep the drivers a fair way from the ears. And I think that might account for one of the things you'll notice when you listen to the Bandoss Avijas. The overall sound of the Avijas is what I would describe as warm and full-bodied, but highly detailed. They produce an excellent soundstage with good size and scale or shape, and the imaging and placement of sounds is absolutely wonderful. Depth and layering in the soundstage isn't quite class leading, and we'll talk more about that with some comparisons in a moment, but it is still very, very good. What impressed me most about the Avijas though is their timbre or their tonality. Remember before that I said that my reference point is how I hear live music or a great pair of 2-channel speakers. That's what listening to the Avijas sounds like. They deliver sound that feels like and sounds like very well tuned, full range, large speakers. They aren't bright and enhanced in the treble like many of the flagship headphones are, and to me that's the strength of the Avijas. Cymbals still have shimmer and splash, but they don't overshadow the rest of the mix. Guitars are articulate and crisp, but they're also resonant and rich. Vocals have body and presence, but also texture and clarity. To me, everything about the Avijas is perfectly balanced. At least, it's perfectly balanced and all perfectly done if everything else is right. Let me explain. The Avijas are a somewhat challenging headphone to drive. We're not talking tungsten difficult or OG Susvara difficult, but they do have an impedance of 44 ohms and more importantly, a sensitivity of 90 decibels per milliwatt. You'll still get these to 110 decibels of sound with just 100 milliwatts, so technically just about any headphone amp can drive them to beyond safe listening levels, but that doesn't mean they're going to sound great with just any old headphone amp. As with any of the true flagship headphones, you'll want to hear the Avijas with a truly high-end source chain if you want to understand what they're really capable of. For example, if you were to use the topping D900 and A900 stack, the Avijas would sound good, but I suspect you'd also be questioning the value of their price tag. Swapping to something like the Chord M-Scaler and Dave with the Burst & Soloist Voyager is where everything then clicks. With that setup, you get a jaw-dropping sense of soundstage size, separation, imaging placement, and overall timbral realism. You then start to hear the nuances that only a flagship headphone with a flagship source chain can actually deliver. And that doesn't mean that you need that exact source chain to hear the best of the Avijas. There are other great DACs like the Linear Tube Aero or the Gustard X30 that will deliver the same kind of experience if you pair them with a premium headphone amp. And by the way, the X30 DAC review is coming very soon, so subscribe if you want to see that one. The point is though, you need to be thinking premium devices with the Avijas, not just upper mid-tier ones, at least if you want to hear them at their best. And speaking of hearing them at their best, I began my time with the Avijas without a cable for them. Not one from Bandoss Audio or Marco Custom Cables anyway. Instead, I began my listening with the Meze Audio PCU HD cable. It's a $269 cable that's already fantastic quality. And on that note, I should mention that the Avijas just use a 3.5mm termination on the bottom of each cup, so you can use any cable like this. And the Avijas sounded very, very good with this cable. However, when the upgrade cable arrived from Marco Custom Cables, the differences were very obvious. This upgrade cable, as well as being beautiful, on the inside uses a combination of high quality copper and graphene, and it definitely unlocks the sound of the Avijas to another step still. Specifically, it's going to grant you a little bit of extra detail and nuance from the Avijas, and it brings the top end to life just a little bit more than that pure copper cable could. Interestingly though, it's not changing the brightness, just the sense of clarity a little bit. And given that the Avijas are a warmer sounding headphone to start with when compared to other flagships, I think a lot of people are really going to appreciate them with that upgrade cable. The sense of clarity and detail you get with the combination, I think, is closer to what most audiophiles will be seeking if they're used to other options like Utopias, Elites, Susvaras, etc. But at the same time, the Avijas with the upgrade cable from Marco Custom Cables are still a little bit magic in the sense that they're also still a little bit different. The cable with those headphones doesn't take away from that wonderful sense of fullness and detail that I think makes the Avijas unique in this upper end of the market. But we also should keep all this in perspective. This is a €700 cable. That's a lot to spend on a bunch of wire. And so just to clarify things, I think if you've got the money and you can afford to buy the Avijas, it is also worth spending the extra to get the Marco Custom cable. But that's also operating on the assumption that if you can afford to buy the Avijas, you probably already have or are going to be getting a really premium system. If you don't have a premium system already, and if you're not going to be in a position to comfortably afford to buy a more premium system, then I think you should save your money on the cable and put it towards better components to drive the Avija. The point being, you'll get more gains with a high quality DAC spending an extra €700 on a DAC than you'll get from just the cable alone. To put it another way, I think the cable is fantastic, but I think you'd get more value going from, say, a topping A900 amp up to a Chord Alto amp than buying the Avijas with the cable and plugging that into the A900. But I guess all of this leads then to another question, which is, would you actually want to listen to the Avijas as your flagship headphone of choice? Or is one of the other flagship headphones a better fit for you? I happen to be in the very fortunate position of having many of the current flagship headphones here in my collection, and so I thought I'd compare all of them for you with the Avijas to help you work it out for yourself. I started with the 2022 version of the Focal Utopias because that's the first headphone I put my hands on. Listening to How Come You Don't Call Me Anymore, the Utopias deliver a wonderfully strong attack on the piano. But I'd suggest that maybe it's just a little bit too much attack sometimes. I was using the Soloist Voyager amp, and it's a fairly polite and refined sounding amp, but it doesn't quite tame the Utopias enough on this track. However, Prince's vocals are magnificently focused and clear from the Utopias. Swapping to the Avijas from the Utopias required a significant jump in volume on the Soloist, going from about a volume level of 15 or 16 in medium game on the Soloist Voyager with the Utopias, all the way up to about 40 for the Avijas. Once the volumes were adjusted, the Avijas also delivered a wonderful sense of attack on the piano notes. But they're not as bright in the treble as the Utopias, and that made the sound less aggressive and easier to enjoy. By having less treble than something like the Utopias, the Avijas don't push details at you or enhance and magnify details in the way the Utopias do. And some people may feel like something's missing from the Avijas if you're used to that kind of detail. I don't find myself missing that, but it depends on your cravings for enhanced detail versus a more natural overall tonality. And in my experience, it's actually very difficult to get both of those together. You can have lots of detail with the Avijas, it's just not that enhanced sense of detail. Continuing the comparison, I think the Utopias might provide just a little bit more sense of separation and focus of the image than the Avijas, and they probably produce just a little bit more sense of depth and layering in the soundstage, but I'm pretty sure that's all a result of the enhanced treble, so you have to be okay with that. And I definitely find that the Utopias can be too bright of a tuning on quite a few different source chains, meaning that they're a headphone where you really need to match the source chain to the headphone. As I tried a bunch of different source chains with the Avijas, they swing from brilliant to more brilliant with whichever source chain I put them on. Whereas with the Utopias, they can swing between brilliant and sometimes a little bit less enjoyable because they're just a little bit aggressive and bright up top. And as such, my Utopias are going to be going on the secondhand market pretty soon because I've got other flagship headphones that each do at least one thing better than what the Utopias do, and I now think the Avijas are a much better all-around headphone for me. And with that said, let's move on to the Meze Elites. With the angled Alcantara pads on the Meze Elites, they've got quite a similar tonality overall to the Focal Utopias, but just not quite as forceful. I've always enjoyed the Elites as a slightly more relaxed flagship headphone experience. They don't force anything, and it makes them constantly or consistently enjoyable. Now the Avijas go toe-to-toe with the Elites, but they also do some things better. Sure, they can't match the Elites for comfort, because nothing can. But the bass from the Avijas is clearly better to me than that from the Elites. It's also better than the Utopias, I should have mentioned that earlier. The bass from the Avijas is a clinic in well-controlled bass impact and presence. The Elites have fairly good presence, and by presence I kind of mean quantity of bass, but they can lack the sense of punch and impact that the Avijas are able to deliver. In the introduction, I mentioned that you can get good bass from flagship headphones, but that it came with a sense of treble emphasis and therefore slightly unnatural tonality at times, and it was the Elites that I was referring to there. They have a boost in the upper treble that brings an extra sense of clarity and air to the sound, but it can also throw off the tonality or the timbre on some recordings. The Avijas don't have that. And that means that some people will miss the sense of extra clarity and air in the top end that the Elites deliver, but I certainly don't. I'll take a natural tonality any day over treble enhancement tricks. I also think the Avijas generally match the sense of staging from the Elites, and so in many ways they're very comparable headphones. And I do still love the Elites, and I'll continue to recommend them to anybody looking for flagship headphones, but I suspect the Avijas will be my go-to recommendation for the absolute most fun flagship headphone that money can buy now. And that brings us to two technical powerhouses. First up is the Susvara Unveiled. If you want nuance and detail in the sound, the Susvara Unveiled are almost impossible to match. The Avijas definitely don't match them in that regard. Much like the Utopias, the Susvara Unveiled, and indeed the original Susvaras, lean into more treble in terms of the overall points of emphasis. As a result, they deliver extra detail and insight compared to other warmer tuned models. And that's because that sense of detail and insight is really only possible by pulling back on the bass, because the bass is going to mask some of those fine details in the upper mid-range and treble, and so you generally can't have both. In fact, not even generally. In my experience, you just can't have both. And unfortunately, that means that whilst the Susvara Unveiled are wonderfully detailed and insightful, they can't deliver the weight and impact of kick drums or toms, as an example. It means that the bass line won't have the same sense of drive and rhythm to it that you'd get if you were listening to live music. It can make classical music sound incredibly detailed and exciting from the Susvaras, but the full power and scale of the orchestra won't be as evident from the Susvaras as it will be from the Avijas. It's all and always a trade-off. The staging on the Avijas is a little bit more compact than it is from the Susvara Unveiled, which tends to spread the soundstage very, very wide, but it also tends to lack a little bit of soundstage depth. I think the Avijas deliver a little bit better sense of depth and layering in the soundstage than the Susvaras, but it does come at the cost of a slightly narrower soundstage. It's not narrow, just narrower than the Susvara Unveiled. I love both of these headphones, but I think the Avijas sound more natural to me, both in terms of their tonality and their soundstage presentation. On a track like Home, the Susvaras can't deliver that sense that you're hearing live music or a great set of full-range speakers. On the other hand, the Avijas can't really match the sense of insight and nuance that the Susvara Unveiled can. And that sense of insight and nuance is really something I've only ever heard on headphones. And that's where headphones sometimes can be different and better than speakers, as opposed to them always needing to be the same. If you are looking for that detail and insight, then the Susvara Unveiled are almost unmatched. And if you're wondering why I'm saying almost unmatched, we're about to get to that. But to finish off this comparison, I would reach for the Avijas anytime I just wanted to get lost in the enjoyment of music, and also for the assessment of audio gear. They are still very detailed and very insightful. However, it's still the Susvara Unveiled that I would reach for if I wanted to get to the absolute tiniest of details in a recording, or to gauge the exact levels of resolution that are available from a DAC or a headphone amp. Although that's also when I tend to turn to the Audeze LCD5s. These are the headphones that do match the Susvara Unveils in my opinion, and I think of the LCD5s as probably the most insightful flagship headphone available. But they also lack that sense of bass weight, just like the Susvara Unveiled and even the Utopias to a lesser degree. For mid-range clarity, soundstage depth and separation, I think the LCD5s are unmatched. And that's still the case even with the Avijas in the world. However, the LCD5s can't recreate that full-range speaker sound that only the Avijas seem capable of. And that's all about the presence, impact and control of the bass from the Avijas. Perhaps you could get the LCD5s there with the right EQ adjustments, but I'm not an EQ user, so I can't comment there. And that lack of bass weight or presence from the LCD5s can sometimes lead them to being a bit less musically engaging. It can make them less emotive than a headphone like the Avijas. And that's why I tend to use the LCD5s more for things like editing and assessment of audio gear rather than pure enjoyment listening. I do still very much enjoy listening to music on the LCD5s. My point here is that there are other headphones that I enjoy even more. And now the Avijas are going to be option number 1 on that list for pure fun listening. And speaking of fun, I don't own the Abyss 1266, but I would say that they're probably the only flagship headphone that I've heard that approaches the bass performance of the Avijas. Unfortunately for the 1266s, they deliver all of their bass punch in the middle of the bass band, and they don't extend particularly deep down low. That means they're going to run out of puff on deep bass notes in, say, electronic music, and they also have a slightly unusual mid-range tuning that can result in some wonky tonality on certain tracks. I do respect and admire the 1266s, but the Avijas to me are the perfect version of what I think the 1266s are intending to do. The Avijas create both a tonally and spatially accurate representation of listening to full-range speakers. They probably don't produce a stage that's as large as the 1266s, this is all going from memory, but the shape of the soundstage is excellent, and the sense of size and space is still very good, and more importantly, the balance in the tonality of the Avijas is more consistent across every track you listen to. However, having said all that about the 1266s and the Avijas, there's actually a different headphone that the Avijas most remind me of, and that's the original Meze Empyreans. If you hated the original Empyreans though, don't worry, because the Avijas are a very different headphone in lots of ways. They've just got some similarities that I couldn't help but think about. To me, the Avijas are like a perfect version of the Meze Empyreans, the original ones. They're a super grown up and refined version of that approach to sound. That means the Avijas are fun to listen to. They'll have you tapping your foot and bobbing your head, while also have you marveling at their technical capabilities. In other words, these don't have the same technical flaws that did hold the Empyreans back from competing with the full-on flagships. The original Empyreans did have a slightly bloated sounding bass, and some of that same Meze audio treble emphasis that some people love and some people hate. The Avijas, on the other hand, deliver a powerful but tight and controlled bass that doesn't ever bleed into the mid-range and create any sense of muddiness or bloat. They deliver tonality from the bottom end of the range all the way to the top end of the range that's very balanced and very natural. Again, it's all about it sounding lifelike to my ears. They deliver vocals and mid-range that sounds natural, and it's very well placed and balanced within the audio mix. And they do all of this with only the tiniest loss of detail and insight when compared to the other best flagships on the market, all of which are noticeably leaner and more brightly tuned than the Avijas. And so if you want to have as much fun as you can have with a pair of headphones, while also getting almost the maximum possible level of insight and detail that you can into the music, you need to buy yourself a pair of Avijas. But at the same time, these aren't for everyone. Fans of the Susvara and similarly tuned headphones will probably find the Avijas to be too warm. But to me, they're spot on. If I'm in a situation where I can't go to hear live music and I can't use my full range speaker setup, these are the headphones that I want on my head. And so I'll put a link in the description down below through to Bandoss Audio in case these sound as good to you as they do to me. There's also more information on the Bandoss Audio website about the design process, the thinking, and the sort of vision, if you like, for the Avijas, so you can click on that link and go through and read up more if you want to. And then if you want a world-class headphone amp to plug any of these flagship headphones into to know that you're getting the best possible sound out of them, I've pinned a video here at the end to my review of the headphone amp that Frank himself uses to listen to his pair of Avijas. And so you can watch that video next. But for now, as always, a huge thanks to YouTube channel members, also to channel Patreon members, and of course to those of you who leave super thanks on videos like this one. And until next time, happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here again soon on Passion for Sound.